Something unbelievable just happened in Formula One. Today was the first day of the 2026 season at the Australian Grand Prix. The first real laps. The first real data. The first chance to see the brand new Red Bull RB22 on track. But instead of dominating the session, Max Verstappen's car stopped in the pit lane. Minutes later, he slid into the gravel and damaged the floor of the RB22. And when the second practice session ended, the reigning champion was only sixth fastest, behind Ferrari, Mercedes, and McLaren. For Red Bull, that almost never happens. But the real shock came after the session. Because Red Bull boss Laurent Mekies revealed something about Verstappen that completely changes how we should look at today's results. According to Mekies, Max is already adapting to the RB22 in a very different way. Not by forcing the car. Not by pushing beyond the limit. But by learning the exact rhythm the new Red Bull Ford power unit requires. And here is why that matters. Because the RB22 is not a normal Red Bull. It is the first car built around Red Bull's own engine project with Ford, one of the most complex power units the team has ever created. Which means the car may have enormous potential. But only if the driver understands how to unlock it. And according to the early data from Melbourne, Max Verstappen might already be doing exactly that. Even on a chaotic day with lost track time and a damaged floor, he was still less than 7/10 from the fastest lap of the session. Which raises a terrifying question for the rest of the grid. If this was Red Bull on a bad day, what happens when Verstappen finally puts together a clean lap? Because there is one technical detail about the RB22 that almost nobody noticed today. And once you see it, you understand why Red Bull might still be the most dangerous team on the grid. So let's break down exactly what happened to Verstappen and the RB22 in Australia. The moment the cars rolled out at Albert Park, everyone in the paddock was watching the Red Bull garage. Not Ferrari. Not Mercedes. Red Bull. Because the RB22 represents something completely new for the team. For the first time in its history, Red Bull is running its own power unit, developed with Ford. And that changes everything. For more than a decade, Red Bull relied on engines built by Honda. Those engines were powerful, reliable, and perfectly integrated with Adrian Newey's aerodynamic philosophy. But the 2026 regulations forced the team to start a completely new chapter. Now the engine, the hybrid system, and the entire energy deployment strategy are controlled by Red Bull powertrains. Which means the RB22 is not just a new car. It is the beginning of a completely new technical identity for the team. And when the car first appeared on track in free practice 1, engineers immediately began studying how it behaved. Visually, the RB22 looked extremely compact. The bodywork around the side pods was tight. The airflow management around the floor looked incredibly sophisticated. Even the suspension philosophy had changed compared to previous Red Bull machines. The goal of all those changes was simple. Efficiency. Aerodynamic efficiency. Energy efficiency. Thermal efficiency. Every element of the RB22 was designed to extract the maximum performance from the new hybrid regulations. But aggressive concepts often come with a cost. They can be extremely fast. But they can also be very sensitive. Small setup changes. Tiny shifts in temperature. Even minor differences in ride height. Any of these factors can move the car outside its ideal operating window. And that may explain something analysts noticed during the first practice session. The RB22 looked quick. But it did not look as comfortable as the dominant Red Bulls of previous seasons. Through some corners, Verstappen's inputs were smooth and confident. But through others, the rear of the car seemed slightly nervous when he applied the throttle. Nothing dramatic. Just small corrections. Tiny adjustments that suggested the balance of the car was still evolving. Despite that, Verstappen still finished the session in third position, behind the two Ferraris of Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Which, on paper, looked like a strong start. But the real test of the RB22 was always going to come later. Free practice 2. because that is when teams usually lower fuel loads, activate more aggressive engine modes, and simulate qualifying pace. This is where the true speed of the car normally appears. And for Red Bull, this was the moment when the entire narrative of the day suddenly changed. Because only minutes after leaving the garage, something went very wrong with Verstappen's car. The RB22 suddenly stopped at the exit of the pit lane. No warning. No obvious cause. Just silence. The mechanics rushed to push the car back into the garage while engineers searched for answers. More than 20 minutes of the session disappeared. And in modern Formula One, that kind of lost track time is extremely expensive. Because those minutes are normally used to collect the most important data of the entire weekend. Qualifying simulations, race pace runs, energy management strategies. Without that data, preparing the car for Saturday becomes much more difficult. But the most surprising moment of the day was still waiting. Because when Verstappen finally returned to the track, the RB22 was about to show just how difficult it could be to control. And when Verstappen finally returned to the track, the RB22 immediately showed how difficult it could be to control. Everything happened very quickly. Verstappen began pushing harder, trying to recover the lost time from the long stop in the garage. He approached one of the fast sections of Albert Park, carrying significant speed through the corner. Then suddenly, the rear of the car snapped. A sharp moment of oversteer. The RB22 slid sideways, crossed the grass, and bounced into the gravel trap. For a moment, the car disappeared in a cloud of dust and stones. As Verstappen fought to regain control, pieces of carbon fiber flew off the floor of the car. When he finally returned to the track, the damage was clear. The floor had been hit hard. And in modern Formula One, that is one of the worst things that can happen during a practice session. Because the floor is responsible for generating most of the car's aerodynamic downforce. When it is damaged, the entire balance of the car changes. Downforce disappears. Airflow becomes unstable. And the driver can no longer push with confidence. From that moment, Verstappen's session was effectively compromised. Even if he continued running laps, the RB22 was no longer showing its true performance. He eventually finished the session in 6th position, behind both Ferraris, both Mercedes, and the McLaren of Oscar Piastri. On paper, it looked like a difficult day for Red Bull. But inside the paddock, several engineers were not convinced that the timing sheet told the full story. Because even with the damaged floor, the lost track time, and the chaotic session, Verstappen was still less than 7/10 away from the fastest lap of the day. And that detail immediately raised an important question. How fast could the RB22 actually be with a clean session? This is exactly where Laurent Mekies' comments after practice became so interesting. Because according to the Red Bull team principal, what we saw on Friday was only the beginning of the learning process. The RB22 is a completely new concept. A new engine. A new hybrid system. A different aerodynamic balance. And according to Mekies, that means the car requires a completely different driving rhythm. Drivers cannot simply jump into this car and push at the limit immediately. They must learn how the new hybrid system delivers power. They must understand how the energy deployment interacts with traction when exiting corners. They must adapt their driving style to match the way the RB22 produces its performance. In other words, this car rewards precision. And that is where Verstappen's adaptation becomes so important. Because according to Red Bull's early data, the world champion is already beginning to understand how to drive the RB22. Not by forcing it, but by adjusting his rhythm. By learning when to apply the throttle, when to manage energy, and when to trust the aerodynamic platform of the car. It may not have looked impressive on the timing sheets. But internally, Red Bull may already see something very promising. Because if Verstappen is already starting to unlock the RB22 after just one day of running, then the rest of the grid might soon discover that Red Bull's chaotic Friday in Melbourne was only the first chapter of a much bigger story.